So today's daf is Kuf Ches, and on the bottom of Kuf Zayin Amud Beis, we began studying the explanation of Bar Pada for these six extra shofros amongst the 13 shofros, and Bar Pada goes through six different cases where you designated a korban, the korban got lost, and then after designating a replacement korban, you found the original korban. And he's got the case of Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur. He's got the Elim of Hasham Gzelos. And now on the top of our Omud, it's Kvasim. This has to do with a Nazir or a Mitzorah. And once again, the Asham of a Nazir, which is brought when the Nazir has to begin his Naziris all over again because he contracted Tumas Mess, or a Mitzorah in the process of purification. The Nazir or the Mitzorah designated a certain keves for a korban oshman and it got lost. Seirim have to do with moadim, that on the various moadim you have to bring seirim, and mosaros. Mosaros means again when you designated 100 and then the price went down, so you have extra surplus money. V'hamah. Okay, the ma has to do with the machzis hashekel, and it's called a kolbon. So let's say, for example, if you and I are obligated to bring a half a shekel, but neither of us has a half a shekel, so we partner together with one full shekel, bring it to the gizbar, and the gizbar then will split that shekel into two halves, one for me and one for you. And there's like a surcharge to pay the gizbar for all the money. There are also situations where the kolbon is not paid as a surcharge, but because, let's say, you had the money after it was given to the gizbar wasn't exact of a half a shekel, so they had to go to a money changer, and the money changer charged money anyway. Whatever it is, that's called ma. Next, why is it that Chizkiah rejected Rabbi Yochanan rejected Chizkiah, and they rejected Bar Pada? Kulu Chizkiah lo Amri. Why did the Amoraim feel inhibited about accepting Chizkiah's explanation that there would be discord between the Kohanim of the Batei Av, as we described, the Kol Chad V'cha, right? We're not afraid that the Kohanim are going to get, resent one another. The Kol Chad V'chad Yom HaKovid, each Kohen is doing his daily service and understands that whatever oros he gets or he doesn't get. Rabbi Yochanan lo Amri, they don't want to accept Rabbi Yochanan because La Pushe Lo Chashina, we don't believe that there's a real serious fear that the coins, if they're put together all in one shofar, would corrode. And Kizeiri lo Amri, because Kiyechid lo Muki, because the Zeiri, as we said before, is based on Rebbe, and Rebbe was the one who said that you have to give the exact animal, the exact korban and its value, can't give more. But we accept the Shita of the Chachamim. And Kebar Pada Nami lo Amri, they didn't like Bar Pada because what's Bar Pada doing? Bar Pada is talking about 6 cases, 5 of which are different specific animals, and then he adds number 6, and that's Mosros, meaning if the funds exceeded the amount that he needs to buy the korban. Well, Kula Nami Mosros. The truth is that all the other 5 are Mosros, so why add a 6th? Now the Gemara says there's another reason why they rejected Bar Pada, because Bar Pada, in addition to counting Mosros, he also counted Ma Nami L'Shkolim Azla. There was a separate shofar for the Shkolim, and they would add the Kolbon, which is called a Ma, they would add that to the Shkolim. It's part of the mitzvah of Shalom Desanya, Lechen Kalbon Zeholech, L'Shkolim Divrei Rabbi Meir. and Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, and therefore we want to square with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir would not have a separate shofar for a ma, which is for the kalbon, because the kalbon was put together with the shkolet. Rabbi Lazar Omer, although Rabbi Lazar disagrees with Rabbi Meir, and he holds Linadava, that they would not put the kalbon back into the machzis hashekel and consider this like an extension and part of machzis hashekel, but rather it was for voluntary karbanos. But as we said before, we want to square with Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara gives two other explanations for the number 6 in Shofros. Shmuel Amar Keneged Mosar Chatus Mosar Osham Mosar Asham Nazir Mosar Asham Mitzora Mosar Minchas Chote Mosar Asiris Ha'efa Shel Kohen Gadol. So Rav Shmuel basically accepts what we saw in Bar Pada, but he wants to take out that extra mosros, which is really a repetition, and instead he plugs in what's called the chavitim of the Kohen Gadol, otherwise known as Asiris Ha'efa. And the Kohen Gadol, as we said many times, has to bring an Asiris Ha'efa in the morning, every morning, and then split it into half, and he brings half in the morning and half in the afternoon. And Shmuel is saying that even with regard to excess funds of the Minchas Chavitim, then we use it for the purpose of an Olas HaTzibur, and therefore we need a special shofar for that, because the underlying premise of Shmuel is that the Torah considers the Chavitim of a Kohen Gadol to be a chatos. And just like we had this entire list, which included Mosar Chatos, where the excess funds for Chatos are given for a Nidavas HaTzibur, or an Olas HaTzibur, that same halach applies to the Asiris Ha'efa of a Kohen Gadol. And Rav Oshia Omar, okay, I'm going to agree with you, Keneged Mosar Chatos, Mosar Osha, Mosar Asham Nozir, Mosar, but here I'm going to add something else, says Rav Oshia, and that is Mosar Kinim. So this has to do with what's called Mechusar Kapara, which is Zav, Zova, Yoletis, and Mitzorah, those 4 Tmeim, in addition to undergoing a process of Tara with mikveh and so forth, and Spheres Nikiyim, they also have to bring pairs of birds. And that's called kinim. Kinim are pairs of birds. In other words, 2 birds together make a ken. And once again, until they bring those kinim of either Shnei Torah or Shnei B'nai Yonah, they are considered Mechusar Kapar, which means allowed to eat kosher and allowed to enter the mikveh. Even if they already went through tefillah and they counted all the Nikiyim, it's not enough. And according to Rav Oshia, we're going to add, for these cases of Mechusar Kapara, another shofar for the Mosar if there is a surplus of money from the pairs of birds that were designated by these Mechusar Kapara. And then Mosar Minchas Chote. Okay. So basically, Rav Oshia agrees with Shmuel, but although these shofros, even according to Rav Oshia, are designated for leftover money and surplus money, nevertheless, Rav Oshia, wants to get rid of, to remove, I should say, the Chavitim Kohen Gadol. He doesn't consider it a chatos, as we said. And instead, he wants to introduce Mosar Kinim. Shmuel, my time alone, Rav Yossi, Kinim Tonale Reisha. If you look at the Reisha of the Mishnah in Shkolim, which has the 7 shofros, amongst those 7 shofros is Kinim. So there's no need to add Kinim again a second time around in the 6. Rav Oshia, on the other hand, Tani velo Tani Chite, velo Tani Kinim. Right, he has 13 shofros, but he doesn't have kinim in the 13. He has, on the other hand, Mosar kinim in the last 6. So Gemara rejects this. Gemara says, Vatani, we have a brisa that says, Rabbi Oshia Tani chitim, he does have chitim. So Gemara answers, it does have kinim. Is chad lekinim and chad lemosar kinim. Right, so there was a special box to collect funds for the kinim in a situation where you definitely have an obligation to bring the kinim, and a second shofar, an additional shofar for the case of Mosar kinim, where the monies were greater than what the birds actually cost because the market price of birds went down. Okay. Rav Oshia, my time Kishmu, why does Rav Oshia reject a shofar designated for the chavita and the Kohen Gadol? Soverle Kamandi Omar, Mosa Shasir Sefer Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav, meaning that the Asir Sefer, which is the chavita and the Kohen Gadol, is not classified as a chatos, even though the Torah does call it a chatos, but I mean the Kohen Gadol is not guilty of any sin. And therefore, if there's excess money in terms of the designation of the Kohen Gadol for his Asir Se'ephah, that excess money is not put into a shofar for the purpose of Olas Hatzibur, but rather it is left to rot. Now, exactly why Yirkav, which means to let it rot, doesn't seem to be too clear. We're talking about funds. We're talking about money that he designated for purchasing his Asir Sefer. We're not talking about the Ephah itself, the grains that he brings as a mincha. In any event, the Sanya, we learned in the Brisa, Mosar Minchas Nedova, Mosar Mincha Yirkav. So apparently this Brisa, as we'll soon see in the name of Rav Chisda, will reflect the situation, the opinion, the ruling that the chavitim is not considered a chatos. It doesn't have the law of let's use these extra funds to buy the ola, but rather it is yirakiv. And that's my comment. The Gemara says, Rav Chisda Hachi Kamer, Mosa Minchas Chotei Nedava, Mosa Asir Se'efa Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. If there's a Minchas Chotei, and the Chotei has to bring a carbon mincha, and he designated a certain amount of funds for the carbon mincha, and there was extra funds, that goes for the purpose of a nidavas hatzibur, an olas nidavas hatzibur. But in the case of Mosar Asir Sefer of a chavit and the Kohen Gadol, if there was excess funds, the funds will not be designated for a carbon tzibur, an olas hatzibur, rather yirakev, and Rav Oshia follows the Shita of Rav Chisda, and because he follows that Shita of Rav Chisda, he could not accept Shmuel, who added a shofar for the purpose of Asir Sefer. Rabba Omer, now we have another explanation of this brisa. Afilu Mosar Asir Sefer Shel Kohen Gadol Nami Nedova. I can assume that even Rav Oshia would accept the fundamental view of Shmuel that the excess funds of the Asir Sefer of the Chavit and the Kohen Gadol is designated for a carbon tzibur, elamosa lachme toda yirkav. So this brisa cannot be brought, says Rabbah, as a proof to support Rav Oshia, because in truth, even this brisa would agree to Shmuel's premise that in the case of Mosar Asir Seif of Chavit Kohen Gadol, you would designate it for a carbon tzibur, but rather what should be read into this brisa is Mosar Lachme Toda Yirkav. Now, the Toda breads are never referred to as a chatos. And all these halachas of the extra funds apply to a chatos, and therefore the excess funds of a toda, they cannot be subject to be brought as an olas hatzibur. Now, you might say, well, let's bring it as another carbon toda. Let's say there's somebody else who needs it for a toda. No, the halacha is that the toda has to come together with the person who vowed to bring the toda, and it cannot be designated for one person to being brought and attached to another person, and therefore Yerakov, we got to just let it rot. And now this issue about what's the story with Mosar of Chavit and Kohen Gadol is subject to a machlokes Tanoim v'Pluta. Mosar Asir Sefer Shel Kohen Gadol Rabbi Yochanan ben Dova and Rabbi Lazar Omar Yirka. Meisvei, the Gemara asks, is it really true that according to this shita of Rabbi Lazar, if you have Mosar of Asir Sefer of Kohen Gadol, you let it rot? What are we going to do with a Mishnah? Now, keep in mind that we're dealing with Amoraim here. They can't argue against the Mishnah. And the Mishnah says that Mosar Shkalim Chulin, right, let's say, for example, you designated more than a Machzis HaShekel, the extra surplus is not Kadosh, it's just Chulin. Mosar Asiris HaEfa, like Mosar Kinei Zavim and Kinei Zavim Kinei Yoldos, V'chatos Hashamos is Mosem Linidama. So you see that we're talking here about Asiris HaEfa, which is the daily, twice daily carbon minchas chavitim of the Kohen Gadol, and yet it says that the Mosar is Linidama, means any excess is designated for a Nidavas Hatzibur. My love, shouldn't we interpret it as Mosar Asir Sefer Shel Kohen Gadol, and yet it says he brought it for as a donated offering? Well, it says, lo, this is not a conclusive proof. We could say the Brisa would hold that Einachinami the Chavitim of Kohen Gadol, if there's Mosar, there's extra funds, it will be designated for a carbon of Olas Hatzibur, but the case in the Mishnah, in this Mishnah in Shkolim, is Mosar Minchas Chote. Yeah, because he points out in the note, obviously, Minchas Chote also is made up of Asir Sa'efa of flour. And that's the mincha that the Bryce has in mind. And the Gemara supports this over Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Mistaber Command Yomi Mosar Asir Sefer Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. And that which it says in the Brisa, Asir Sa'efa, is not referring to the Kohen Gadol at all, but rather to Minchas Chote. The sign, because I learned in the Brisa, Lo Yosim Olecha Shem V'Loitin Ole Levona Ki Chatos Hi. Rabbi Yehuda Hi Kriya Chatos Vein Acheres Kriya Chatos. The extra word he is a mute to tell you that ki chatos he, only this case, in the case of minchas chote, that's called a chatos. Lafuke, to exclude the case of asir se'efa of a Kohen Gadol, Eina Kriya Chatos, Tuna Levona, right? A chatos always leaves out levona. We once tried to explain that levona is something, luxurious and has a pleasant smell. It's not appropriate to bring that together with a korban chatos, which is about sin. And the Kohen Gadol has nothing to do with sin. We're not accusing the Kohen Gadol of sin. He has to bring his daily korban, call it a kiddush of the Kohen Gadol for the avodah of the Kohen Gadol. Hence, there's going to be levona, like any other korban that mincha that deserves levona and has levona. And not only that, if there's Mosar, then we cannot, as we would if it were a real true chatos, designated for, collective carbon ola, but rather your yirkav. With the ena kriya chatos Mosar yirkav. All right, this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Kuf Ches. Again, we're talking about cases where he took a pledge and we're not sure exactly how he fulfills that pledge. For example, Shar ze ola. He points to a shar and he says, "This is an ola." Now, according to Rebbe Shita that we discussed both yesterday and today, that you got to give exactly what you um, pledged. Then this Mishnah says nistaev, if you cannot bring this shar as an ola because it was blemished, imrotza yavi b'dam of shnayim, he can bring two shvarim to replace that ola, but that's not true according to Rebbe. But the answer is, my friends, this could work out even according to Rebbe. Why? Because we're talking about shar zeh. Now, let's understand. There's a neder and there's an edav. A neder is a general pledge. An edava is when you point to something and you say, "This is my karma," which is exactly what happened here. Now, if you say in a dava, "This is it," then you don't have any responsibility to replace it in event that it gets lost. In the case of a neder, which is a generic kind of obligation, a commitment, you've got to replace it if it gets lost. That's called achrayus. But in the case of an edava, there's no achrayus. And if there's no achrayus, then Rebbe's shita that you have to replace it with the exact same karman, and the gadol with a gadol and a cotton with a cotton and so forth and so on, that doesn't apply over here. It's just a matter of money. So therefore, he's going to pay up the money that he committed himself to pay, and it doesn't matter whether he buys the same shar or two shvarim, even according to Rebbe. Or another case, shnei shvarim elu ola. Right, again, elu means he points to it, and therefore he doesn't have a achrayus if it's lost, and that's called a nedava. Then his tava that became blemished, so he's off the hook. The only thing is, since he committed himself to the value of, in this case, two shvarim, ratzi yavi b'tmeim echad, he can decide that he wants to be one large shar, which is worth the same as two small shvarim, and l'chora, even according to Rebbe, this should be mutab. However, the Mishnah says Rebbe Oser. The Gemara is going to say that this Rebbe Oser here is only a gzera derabanan, meaning Rebbe is always afraid that even though the halacha differentiates and allows for an edav as opposed to a neder, but nevertheless, we're always afraid he's going to get confused, and even in the case of neder, he'll apply that same yardstick, that same halachic principle. Ayel ze ola, once again, the same kind of principle that nisav becomes blemish. Rotzi yavi b'dov of keves, even though a keves is worth less than an ayel. Let me just double check if he points that out here. Okay, I don't see it right here, but that's the assumption. And nisav rotzi yavi b'dov of ayel, he can now bring an ayel which is worth more than, just want to say I skipped a few words, keves ola, which is worth more than a keves. And Rebbe Yosef again is the Gzeira D'Rabbanan. Okay, that's for Kuf Ches Omer Al.